So this is how our application looks. You select a value and it is added to the cart component. The total is added to the total component. This total, for example, we want to make a global context. At the moment, the total is calculated in this area and this total is passed as props to this component. We can make all the data sets as global, but at the moment we'll take this total and we'll try to make this a global value. Now we are going to set up the context API. There are three main steps I consider to set up the context API. Let me describe these steps. This will make the whole process easy. It's a simple 3 steps process. The first step is you create the context, second, provider, and third, the consumer. And trust me, these are just words, but implementing this is very simple. Now let's talk about the first step. So to create a context, we will use react.createContext method. Here is the syntax. This is as per the official documentation. I'll say const myContext is equal to react.createContext. In the brackets, you can specify the default value. So myContext here becomes the global context object. In our case, it will be, for example, total context. So I'll say const total context is equal to react.createContext, and I want that the total should have 0 by default. So I'll pass 0 here. If we had to make the entire product data set global, we could write something like this: const prod context, that is product context, is equal to react.createContext, and here you can pass the object literal, or you can avoid passing anything for that matter. So this is just a way to declare the context. In short, the value you pass within create context is the initial or default value, and you can later on add and manipulate and do a lot of things with this value as well. So let's do the first and then we will go to the second step. So the first thing is I'm going to create a global folder here in the SRC. You name this folder as global, you can name it as context, or generally there is a practice that we give a global store. I give this store folder. Now inside this I want to create the context. So I'll create a file first of all, and I name this as, let's say, totalcontext.js. So this is going to contain the context. Here I'm going to import the React. So I'll say import React from React, of course. So here I'm going to create the context. So I'll say const total context is equal to react.createContext, and I want 0 as a default value, and I should export the total context because you'll be importing it at various phases. So here I'll say default total context. So now you can say that we have created the global context, and this is the way we do it. Now comes the second step. Once the context is created, we have to provide it. If you see the syntax, it goes like this: myContext.provider, then there is an attribute called value. This is a fixed attribute. Then you pass a value which can be a string, a number, a boolean value, or even an object literal. Then you have the component which is wrapped by this provider component. In our case, it will be something like this, where we'll have the total context.provider, then the value, and total is the value which we will see in a moment, which resides in the app.js, and total is the component where we want this value to be available. Do remember that here provider is a React component available with the context object, and we need it to wrap around all the components who want to refer to the context. For example, in this case, app is wrapped by the context provider, means the context is available to the entire app and the subcomponents. And in this case, the total component is wrapped by the provider. It means the value total is available to the total component with the help of context API. but not to the other components. So do make sure that whichever components are going to refer the context, they have to be wrapped by the provider. Now let's go to the coding and start implementing this provider component. Very simple again. We just have to import the context. So I'm going to say import. The name of the context is certainly the total context, and that is imported from the store and total context. So once we are done with this, it means we can use it here. So instead of this total now, this I need to wrap. So I'll say total context dot provider, which is a component. Here I'm going to say value is equal to, now this value, the total value, that we pass here with the value attribute, and the end of this provider will be after the total component, so that we wrap it. Now the important point here is that we do not need to pass this as props, so we can certainly remove the attribute total from this place. So before we move to the third step, let's run the application and see what is the output. So once I put this provider here and I removed the attribute total, which is passed as props, let us see what is the output. I'll go to the output and you can see that now there is no total getting displayed. If I select various options, the total is not available. Very obvious that the total we are not passing, which was earlier getting passed as props. How should we refer this global context now? We'll go to the total.js. Here we have to use the context, of course. So I'm going to say total context. So that's going to import as well. Dot consumer. Consumer is going to consume the value. So this is going to be the beginning, and let me put the end at the end of division. Now if I go and check the output, it still does not show anything. On the contrary, it stopped execution. The reason is the consumer component doesn't work directly like this. In fact, you have to put a children. So I'm going to open the curly bracket and it takes a function. Inside this function, you have to return the JSX of the component. So I will just cut the component and put inside the function of this consumer. So this is going to now return the JSX. This is what the syntax is. You give the consumer and it has a function which is going to return the component JSX. Not only this, before I add few more important points, let me check the output. So here, at least now the functionality is there. The component is getting displayed, but still we don't have the total. The function which we have inside the consumer, that receives the context here. Now at the moment we have just one value in the context, that is the total. So that I am going to receive here in this function. And because we are receiving, I do not need props anymore. And here also I'm going to remove the props. Now total is directly available as it was available in app.js. Let me just save this and go back to the output. I'll just reload the screen and let's start selecting the values. So now you see that the context API has been implemented and value total is actually now available as a global context. Remember that total is the component which is wrapped by the provider. So it's available in the total component only. Let's try to put this total in the cart component as well. If I go to the cart and write the similar JSX, let's say total context dot consumer, and this I'm going to end after the division. Now I'm going to add the children. So open the bracket and the function. Here I'll say total and it's going to return the JSX. The JSX will have this entire component. So I'm going to cut the component and paste inside this return statement. That's it. And after this UL, I want to show the total directly here. The important point here is if I check the output, I'm not going to get the total here. The reason is when we use the provider, here I have to wrap the cart component also with the provider. So let's do that. I'll just save this and open the output. Now you see that all the values. Let me refresh and try it again. So you can see once again the total is now available in both the components, that is cart and total respectively. So we have used the context API, the provider and the consumer, the 3-step implementation, and we could achieve a global context here in this sample. I also want to add one more point. Writing the consumer like this is actually a kind of complicated syntax. But now in the newer version of the React, we have the useContext hook, and that's what we are going to implement in the next section. We'll convert the same application with the useContext hook in the next section. So now let's talk about relative questions. The first question is explain the concept of context API and how do you implement it in your project. So we have seen that whenever you feel that you need to have some data pieces available to various components, multiple components that is, maybe for the entire application, then you use the context API, and first of all you create the context, second you implement the provider, and third is you use the consumer. The second question is, with the provider component, like in this statement, can you choose any name for the value attribute? No, it's not possible. You have to use value, as provider is built-in React component and that has provided this value attribute. So it's not your custom component where you can have your own attributes. You must follow this rule while using the provider component. The third question is, how does the context.consumer, that is the consumer component, work? Context.consumer is a React component that is subscribed to context changes. It requires a function as a child. This function receives current context value, as you can see here in the syntax. The fourth question is, what will be the context value if there is no provider used? Well, if you do not have the provider in your application, then the consumer will not receive the updated values, that is the updated state. In that case, whichever default value is given with the react.createContext, that will be received in the context value parameter.